Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome to the webinar. We usually get started a couple minutes, especially now. We realize that there could be some technical difficulties with a lot of people being on networks and online. So we apologize in advance if there's any issues. We'll do our best to help. If you have issues in your area, if you can't hear the presenters or see the slides, let us know. At any time, you can ask a question. If you look in your navigation bar on the right side of your screen, you'll see a drop down for questions. And you can type any questions in there anytime during the webinar, including for issues you're having with your screen. You can also email webinar support there at the email address, and we'll try to help you there as well. And if you look in your navigation bar, you also have some handouts today. We have the slides are available in the handouts, and we also have a few flyers, which I'll talk about here in a minute. Okay, today if you're looking for certificates of attendance for the webinar, you have to be registered or in the room with someone who is, and you need to attend for at least 60 minutes. If you happen to have people in the room with you today who would like a certificate, you can put the names of the people in the questions box and we'll make sure they get those as well. And typically we send out certificates within a week, or usually less, but within a week of the webinar.
Our first speaker is Ryan Albert. Ryan is the Chief of the Standards and Risk Reduction Branch in EPA's OGWDW. This branch is responsible for establishing national drinking water related policies and regulations related to microbial pathogens, PBPs, cyanotoxins, and PFAS. He has 15 years experience at EPA, including work in implementing EPA's drinking water regulations, stormwater management, ballast water and vessel regulation, and managing interbasin water transfers. He's received degrees from Emory University and his PhD from George Mason University. And with that, I'll pass the belated podium to Ryan.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Tom. And just want to confirm real quick with folks, you can hear me before I switch over exclusively to my PowerPoint presentation here?
Yes, I can hear you, Ryan.
Well, great. Well, that's good news, Tom, at least one. So I think we're in good shape. I'm going to assume the other 1,000 or so on the line can as well. So first of all, thank you all for inviting me to give a talk about how we develop regulations under the Safe Drinking Water Act. It's for me, this is nice to give today. It's a little bit of normalcy as I have my 3 kids at home with me, 1 doing a virtual piano lesson and 2 playing. So it's about that time of day for a wrestling match to break out. So if you hear some screaming, you know, there's no need to call social services. It's happened about every day for the last 3 weeks or so. Okay. Trying to go to the next slide. My computer is just not being very cooperative. There we go. So briefly, what I'm going to talk about today is just give an overview of how we develop regulations under the Safe Drinking Water Act for new contaminants. Safe Drinking Water Act is obviously a very important public health protection statute. Originally passed in 1974, it directs the EPA to set enforceable health standards for contaminants in drinking water. And those are typically expressed as national primary drinking water regulations. Now, when we establish national primary drinking water regulations, they're expressed in one of 2 ways, and I'll talk about this in a little bit later in the presentation. What folks most commonly recognize are maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs. Folks may also be familiar with the concept of treatment techniques that we use when we are establishing requirements for particular contaminants that may not be easily monitored or may be infeasible or economically unachievable to monitor for or otherwise ensure compliance. The 1996 SDWA amendments, Safe Drinking Water Amendments, changed the process significantly for developing various drinking water regulations, and so there's several components of that process. It's a rather lengthy and very deliberative process, and I'm going to talk through each of these a bit. The first is formulation of the contaminant candidate list. What else we do to gather additional data is the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. We also, based on information we have for occurrence data, health information, and other information, which I'll talk about momentarily, we make a regulatory determination whether to regulate or not to regulate a contaminant we've evaluated. Then we actually go through the process of establishing the national primary drinking water regulations. And finally, after our drinking water regulations have been established, to encourage the agency not to be static, to always evaluate and ensure that we can't improve public health protection, we conduct what's called a 6-year review, where we evaluate our previous regulations to ensure that there's not a way that we can improve public health protection with those regulations. So here's a chart of that regulatory process. I'm going to come back to this several times throughout this presentation. No need to memorize it right now for the test. So you can actually kind of see how this all flows together. First thing I'm going to talk about before coming back to it is in the top left, the contaminant candidate list, or the CCL, and then the UCMR, unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. So the contaminant candidate list, bear with me for just one moment while I move go-to screen. It's a list that EPA starts to put together, or that puts together, of unregulated contaminants that are known or anticipated to occur in public water systems. And the way that we do this is we go through it and using the best available science. We gather information on multiple unregulated contaminants. We look where there's occurrence data. We look where there may be health information related to contaminants. And we start from a universe that includes roughly on the order of about 10,000 potential contaminants. Using the information in that database we pull together, we narrow it down to the PCCL, or preliminary contaminant candidate list. And based upon going through and doing further evaluation of those contaminants, which can vary from a few hundred to as many as 1,000, we will go and actually go forward with the CCL. As part of the CCL, we do a proposed CCL, we take public comment on that CCL, and then we finalize the CCL. We also include several consultations, including with our EPA Science Advisory Board, to ensure we're using the best available science and considering a wide variety of scientific viewpoints. So once again, consider what health effects and occurrence information to put on the list. And this list is really designed to help us focus the agency's resources, both the data monitoring activities we do, the data gathering activities, the research we might do on health effects, on those contaminants we think there may potentially be the greatest potential impact for public health. The most recent CCL, which is out there right now, CCL4, has 97 chemical contaminants, including PFOA and PFOS, the two most well-studied PFAS compounds, and 12 microbial contaminants on it. We're currently beginning the process now of developing the CCL5, because the CCL must be issued every 5 years. So the next slide, once it comes up, what it's going to list is all of those contaminants that are on the CCL. And there's 8 that I've highlighted a different color. All right. And those are the ones that we've made the most recent proposed regulatory determinations. So we get to, these are the various contaminants we have. I won't go through the ones that are highlighted, all of them, but you may know PFOA and PFOS are 2 that are highlighted, and for those we made a preliminary positive determination, and those are the ones that I think we've had the most interest in from stakeholders and others over this last cycle. So if we go to the next slide, I'll come back to regulatory determinations in just a moment. Okay, so here's the overview slide again. I'll go on and say, let's skip to the next one, so it's going to take a second. The next piece of information we really need is good ideally nationally representative occurrence data. If we're going to mandate that public resources are spent on treatment for contaminants and monitoring for contaminants, we want to ensure that it's good value for the public, that we're delivering public health protection, improvements in public health protection that really are worth the resources expended. So one of the tools we use to gather good nationally representative occurrence data is the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. And so the Safe Drinking Water Act requires the EPA monitor for no more than 30 unregulated contaminants every 5 years. And so we've monitored for the last UCMR, for instance, monitored for 30 contaminants. And we use the data once again to gather information for those contaminants we suspect are present in drinking water, and we use many different sources of information to inform that decision. Once again, this is used to inform our whether or not we make a regulatory determination, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And just so you kind of get a sense of some of the recent UCMRs, we had the UCMR from 2013 to 2015, the UCMR3, and this is where we monitored for 6 PFAS compounds, for instance, and are using some of those data to inform our current regulatory determinations activities. UCMR4 is being monitored, is going through the cycle right now, 2018 to 2020. One of the issues or one of the contaminants that have really been present a lot lately is or are cyanotoxins, and so that particular cycle is monitoring for 10 different cyanotoxins or congeners of certain cyanotoxins. And finally, UCMR5 is under development, and the monitoring is anticipated to occur from 2023 to 2025 if we maintain our schedule. And that one so there's going to be some interesting. There's always, all data is interesting, but I think the public may find these data particularly interesting. EPA issued a PFAS action plan just a little over a year ago in February of 2019. And as part of that, we committed to monitor for at least some PFAS. Additionally, recently, EPA has been directed, if funding is allocated appropriately, to require monitoring for all PFAS, for which we have methods as part of the next UCMR cycle, and that was under the Defense Authorization Act. So to the next slide. So now we get to the regulatory determination. So we have our data, ideally UCMR data, but it doesn't have to be UCMR data. It can be other data that we pull together to inform a decision. And these data, so actually I'm skipping a little ahead here, those go to inform if the contaminant is known to occur or there's a substantial likelihood that the contaminant will occur in public water systems. So these are the data. This is one of 3 prongs we look at, whether or not we're going to make a meaningful determination, or if we're going to make a positive determination to regulate a contaminant. Another incredibly important thing is the contaminant may have an adverse effect on the health of persons. So we use various risk assessments. For instance, we may use the Science Behind a Health Advisory or EPA's IRIS assessments, for those of you who are familiar with these sorts of evaluations, to inform that element of whether or not it has an adverse effect on people. And then finally, this is an important one. In the sole judgment of the administrator, regulation of such a contaminant presents a meaningful opportunity for health risk reduction for persons served by public water systems. So it doesn't merely need to be present, and it doesn't merely need to cause health effects. Not that those two things are in any way trivial, but we also have to be able to identify a meaningful opportunity to improve or to reduce health risks. To the next slide. And so you can see we go through, if we make a positive determination, if we say yes to all 3 of those criteria, and if we say no to any one of those criteria, we make a negative determination. And I'll skip to the next slide, just to make up a little bit of time here. Now, I'm not going to go through every word on this particular slide, but this just shows some of the factors that we consider. I'll jump straight down to the sole judgment of the administrator. So as staff, we make recommendations to the administrator that in his or her judgment, they will make a determination whether or not there's a meaningful opportunity. Some of the information we provide to them are things such as how does this affect sensitive subpopulations? Is this a local issue? Is this more of a regional issue? Are we seeing this as a national distribution in the case of occurrence data? Do we consider the nature of the contaminant? Is it highly toxic? Is it something that have more of a chronic effect? We also consider treatment available. So there's a whole slew of things that we consider, and it can vary based upon the contaminant because each contaminant can present unique factors. To the next slide. So here's just a timeline. Once again, I'll go through very briefly. But you can see that we've gone through 4 cycles of the CCL. We're on the 4th cycle of the regulatory determination note. It's pointing to 2019, but we actually got that regulatory determination out, the most recent one. It published in the FR, the Federal Register Notice, on March 11th, 2020. We actually announced a little bit earlier than that, late February, and had a pre-publication copy available for review. We can also see there's the UCMR cycles, once again, roughly every 5 years. That we've gathered the nationally representative occurrence data. Now, for RegDet, we are currently in a public comment period. So for anybody who would like to review what our determinations are, we made 2 positive determinations, preliminary positive determinations to regulate, 6 negative, and it's currently open for public comment until May the 10th, if I recall correctly, or maybe May the 12th, actually, because I think May the 10th fell on a Saturday. So I believe it's May the 12th. To the next slide. Okay, so now here's where we get to the rule. And the way a lot of people see the regulatory determinations process, and sometimes how it's picked up, this is a complex regulatory process. We absolutely get it. But the way it's sometimes picked up and run with is EPA has made a positive regulatory determination. Okay, that's it. When do we start having water be treated for it? And really, that's yet one more step in the process. Then we actually go to developing the rule. And for anybody who's worked with a regulatory agency in the federal government, you probably realize this is an incredibly complex process that requires a tremendous amount of analyses to once again ensure that we are making decisions that meet our mission, in this case protecting public health, but also ensure that we are spending public resources wisely. To the next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to actually run through a few of the things we consider when we do the preliminary proposed rule. So we have 24 months, SDWA mandates that we must propose a rule within 24 months of making that final regulatory determination. So once again, using the case of PFOA and PFOS, under SDWA, we need to make the regulatory determination once every 5 years. And so for us, that's going to be early 2021, January 2021, by which we need to make the final regulatory determination for PFOA and PFOS. We may make a positive, we may make a negative, depends upon additional information we see, and it depends upon the public comments we receive. Once we make that determination, if we were to make a positive regulatory determination, then we begin the process of developing the rule, and we must propose it within 24 months. So several of the things we do when we develop a rule. First is we develop a maximum contaminant level goal. This is the ideal number at which, under which you're going to say there's no known or adverse effects on the health of persons. So basically, what's the number that's protective of public health? So we must use the best available science and data when we do it. And we try to make the information, we must make the information as comprehensive and ideally understandable as possible. To the next slide. Okay, we also examine what treatment technologies are available. We, as folks on this webinar know, we have a wide variety of existing treatment technologies that are available. There's many more that are being researched. And so we look to identify the best available treatment technologies to find what is out there that can actually control or reduce this particular contaminant. If that best available treatment technology is something that is relatively expensive, we also ensure that we identify affordable small system compliance technologies. To the next slide. So this is an important part. We have the MCLG, and we've got some information on treatment. Now, we've also thought about things such as monitoring. We've also thought things about such as compliance regimes, and frankly, what is an implementable reg? What is something that utilities can actually do that helps improve public health protection? And taking these things into account, we then use that information typically to establish an MCL, or maximum contaminant level. And so this may take costs and benefits into account. So if you may have a MCLG of 0 for a particular contaminant, let's say because it's a carcinogen, you may actually set that MCL at 80 or 100 of whatever the unit may be, because you're considering costs and the benefits that are delivered by putting that technology into place. Now, there's sometimes that it's not economically or technologically feasible to measure the level of contaminant, or we may consider other factors related to measuring a specific contaminant. And in these cases, we propose a treatment technique. And so, for instance, you may have things such as monitoring for or installation for some microbial pathogens such as Giardia and Cryptosporidium, where we use treatment techniques to help control introduction of those pathogens into finished drinking water. To the next slide. Okay, so as part of that reg, and I alluded to this a minute ago, we established criteria and procedures and monitoring and reporting our examples to assure that we have a supply of drinking water that dependably complies with the drinking water regulation. So it's not just enough, we're not going to go out there and throw a number out there and say, hey, utilities, go meet this number. We also want to ensure that we establish a framework whereby utilities can meet that number, and importantly, they can demonstrate compliance with it. To the next slide. Okay, so a very important component is we have a health risk reduction cost analysis. And this is where we really generate a lot of our information, where we consider what are the costs that we estimate using the best available information out there, how much is this going to cost utilities, and then what are also the benefits, both the quantified, those costs that we can say, we know that X issue, X disease costs Y amount of dollars, but also the unquantified benefits, or some things we know that we have more trouble quantifying, but they result in adverse health outcomes. So we go through and analyze all of these things as part of what we consider. And this includes also effects on sensitive populations, and then increased health risks that may result from compliance. So are we actually negating some of the public health benefits? Then also relevant factors as well. So this is very, very important information for establishing the treatment technique, or MCL. To the next slide. So after we propose, then we actually we go through and we summarize the benefits and whether or not they justify or do not justify the cost of the regulation. I alluded to this a bit in the last slide. So to the next slide. And finally, we want to ensure that we are considering not just what we see and not just the information in front of us, but we want to get input from other experts in the field. So we consult with numerous entities, many mandated by Safe Drinking Water Act or executive orders, and some of these just include EPA Science Advisory Board. You may also have heard the National Drinking Water Advisory Council. This is typically staffed with representatives from state regulatory agencies, from utilities, from others. May include public health representatives or environmental organizations. We consult with the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And then also as needed, we look at establishing small business advocacy review panels, and look at state and local government officials per the Unfunded Mandate Reform or Review Act. Sorry, I should know that one. And then tribal officials. And this is not a comprehensive list. This is just some of the ones where we tend to put more efforts. Not that those are unimportant, but these are some of the more important ones here. To the next slide. So after we propose it, we have 18 months to finalize it, which we must consider public comments received. Typically, we'll do a 60 or 90-day public comment period, and then we'll finalize that regulation after considering and addressing those comments, and then we consult with NPDWRs again, and then also the Secretary of Health and Human Services. To the next slide. And so finally, I'm bringing this slide up one more time. Once again, once we promulgate a rule, it's not necessarily designed to be there unchanged in perpetuity. To the next slide. this point, we go to our 6-year review, which occurs once every 6 years. Now, if we just promulgate a reg and our 6-year review cycle is up, we're not going to review that reg 2-3 years later. We're going to skip that cycle and we'll go to the next one. So it might be 7, 8, 9 years before we review it. But once again, this is designed for EPA to review each of our existing national primary drinking water regulations and, as appropriate, to make revisions to those regulations. And so we basically look at, is there new information? Are there new data out there? Looking at health effects and occurrence. We also look at how unregulated contaminants interact with some of the regulated contaminants. And a very, very important piece, any revisions must maintain protection or provide for greater public health protection. So typically we focus on providing for greater health protection, but if we're making changes and we improve efficiencies, as long as we maintain or improve protection, that's okay too. And at EPA, we remain very concerned. Obviously, our primary mission is to protect public health, but we also want to be sure that the resources that the utilities spend are spent efficiently so that we provide the greatest bang for the buck, so to say.
Thank you very much for that presentation. So we'll now go on to the second presentation by Sherry Loos. And before I introduce Sherry, I'd like to mention that in the drop-down menu for this webinar, you can see a questions box. Feel free, please, if you can think of questions for Ryan, for Sherry, please type them into that questions box, and then we'll sort them out as best we can and answer the questions on the top of the hour when we get to the questions period. So if you have any questions for our presenters, please type them into the question box, and we'll deal with them at the end of the second talk. And the second talk will be given by Sherry Loos. Sherry's the Rural Community Assistance Program, or RCAP, coordinator for the Great Lakes Community Action Partnership in Ohio. Throughout her 18-year career with RCAP, she served as a technical assistance provider in Pennsylvania and began a GIS program and built a GIS team to inventory, map, host, and maintain utility data for small communities in Ohio. In addition to GIS services, she's helped numerous communities and utilities with asset management, project development, rate studies, grant writing, and management training. Sherry has degrees from Allegheny College and from Iowa State University, and she holds GISP and AWAM certifications. And with that, I'm hoping I can hand this presentation over to Sherry. Sherry, are you ready?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can. Excellent.
All right. And Ryan, you're in good company. I have my 3 kids downstairs. For the time being, they're being quiet. Hoping it stays that way. And I have a dog to boot, so we'll see if we get through this okay. All right, well, thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be with you today, working from a home office, which I'm not used to. And I'm going to talk to you about our amazing technical assistance programs in the Great Lakes RCAP region. Let's see. For those of you who are not familiar with RCAP, so we are a network of nonprofit organizations providing technical assistance and training to small and rural water and sewer systems. We have a presence in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and a few other places I'm sure I'm missing. At the national level, we have our Rural Community Assistance Partnership office in DC, and they help coordinate our efforts to secure federal funding and also to speak for the network on advocacy issues. For us in the Great Lakes region, you can see I've circled it. We have 7 states, and we really are the boots on the ground to go out and help our small systems. Our program in Great Lakes started in 1980. Our program, we're operated by the Great Lakes Community Action Partnership out of Fremont, Ohio. Great Lakes directly operates this program in 4 of our states, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois. And then we contract with community action agencies in Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Across the region, we have 60 technical assistance providers, GIS professionals, and regional support staff. And last year, we served over 700 communities. Our funders at the national level include USDA Rural Development, US EPA, and the Department of Health and Human Services. And then in Ohio, and I'll highlight this a little bit later, we receive funding from Ohio EPA's Division of Drinking and Groundwaters and the Ohio Water Development Authority. So we provide that technical assistance and training to small systems to build their technical, managerial, and financial capacity. Our goal is to enable them to sustainably operate their water and sewer infrastructure. And this is really the core of our program. And then in Ohio, as well as some of our other states, we've expanded our services using other funding sources and also in some cases leveraging local dollars to expand our offerings in pursuit of this mission. So under most of our programs, we're able to help communities that are under 10,000 in population, but really our priority is to work with smaller communities. I would say the vast majority of those are certainly under 5,000, and we work with lots of communities that may have anywhere from a few dozen customers up to a couple of hundred. And in some cases, we're just working with communities that may not have a system. We help rural areas that need public service, and so we are able to help them and work with them. One thing I think that distinguishes us is maybe from other technical assistance organizations, we can work with our client communities for as long as it takes. If they are willing to work with us, we will stay in there with them to help them through their project. And in some cases, this can take years, especially if it's new infrastructure that we are trying to fund. So how do we help communities? Really, we can break this down into 4 areas: fostering vision among those communities, leveraging funds, facilitating environmental compliance, and achieving sustainability. Fostering vision, I mean, one thing that we do is we work with those utility oversight boards, village councils, the local decision makers. And we do this in a number of ways. We offer a number of board training events during the year. We have self-paced online training available for them. When we go into a community, often we are doing a technical, managerial, and financial assessment to see where their needs are. We can help communities with strategic planning, and oftentimes we are trying to help them plan, certainly for their capital improvement needs in the future. And increasingly, we have gotten involved with promoting regionalization and shared services among small communities, as this is really important moving forward in the future. There's so many small systems that are really struggling, and this is the way that they're going to be able to stay in business, is by coming to that realization that on their own they don't have those economies of scale. If we can try to bring more of them together, that will improve their capacity overall. So one of the things we do, of course, is help communities leverage funds. We help them through the whole planning, project planning and development process, helping them from the early start of the project if we're invited in time, to help them think about, well, what do they really need? How do they go about hiring an engineer? And then coming up with that funding strategy and helping them along through the process in working with all of the potential funders and trying to bring that project together. And this is just a flow chart of what typically might happen in helping communities with planning, project development, and funding. So we can come in at any point in this process. Sometimes we are there from the very beginning in trying to help them just figure out, do we have enough community support for a project? You know, do we need to conduct some public hearings or community interest surveys? Then moving on to, okay, we are ready now to hire an engineer. How do we go through a qualification-based selection process to select one? Coming up with that funding strategy. What are they eligible for? You know, what is a likely scenario for bringing funding in? What's the best case, worst case? And then we actually help them apply for those fundings. We help them do income surveys if they're possibly going to be eligible for CDBG funding, for example. And then we help them in completing all of the financial reports for those funding agencies. Environmental compliance. We often do environmental reports for the federal funding programs, USDA, CDBG, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as examples. And then, of course, we coordinate those projects throughout the process. We facilitate environmental compliance. So we have right now about 9 operators throughout our region. And, you know, we have a lot of staff who do a lot of things, but no one does everything. So we have folks who have expertise in the project development and funding side, but then we also have operators on staff who can go out and work with those small systems on any number of issues. So they can do operational assessments, a lot of training, emergency response plans, on-site troubleshooting, many different things. And then just trying to achieve that sustainability over time. We work with a lot of systems on many things so that they have all of the tools to be sustainable into the future. We have grown a pretty large GIS program. I'll highlight that in a few minutes. Of course, we do water audits, water loss mitigation plans. Recently, we've obtained some equipment to do things like utility locating, meter testing. We have staff who do vulnerability assessments, emergency response plans, contingency plans. Increasingly, we are going into communities and helping them figure out what are the best management practices for their distribution system. Are they doing unidirectional flushing? Can we help them with come up with a plan for that? For valve exercising. We often advise them about handling their delinquent accounts. If they're having a delinquent accounts issue, we can help them with policies to try and combat that. Oftentimes we'll come in and we will just help them review those rules and regs, and then of course implementing their best management practices and SOPs to properly operate their system. We do a lot of rate studies, and this is something I think we do in just about every state. So we, of course, you know, I think one thing that's important to point out, you know, we're a third party in this when we come in to do a rate study. We don't have a dog in the fight, so to speak. You know, we want them to be sustainable, but we don't have a financial stake in whether or not they raise those rates. So we're going to give them an honest opinion as far as what they need to be doing. So one thing, you know, certainly in Ohio at least, we know that all of the funding agencies are really pushing, wanting to promote regionalization. And this is something that RCAP has really been leading the way in doing. We did, as a network, the National Office secured funding for us through a private foundation last year to work in this area. But it's something that we were already doing. We lead trainings on this, and oftentimes we are really the ones that are trying to promote this and recommend to communities that they really need to think about their options, keep their minds open, and consider the possibilities of regionalizing. And we've developed a number of tools and training materials to this end. Next slide. And I'll just put a quick plug in here. Most of our services are for communities, but we have gotten some funding to start programs that actually help individuals. So we do get a little bit of funding from US EPA to do private well assessments, and we do many of those each year in several of our states. And then we also receive money from USDA Rural Development to have a private well loan program for low to moderate income homeowners. And so these are two programs that we offer to try and help make sure rural residents who cannot be served by public water systems have access to the funds so that they have safe drinking water. Next slide. Okay, so I was just going to give you a quick tour of our region. Next slide. And every state is a little bit different in terms of how we deliver our services, what services are most popular and needed. Of course, it depends on the environment. Our states in the Great Lakes states, Midwest, we don't have the same challenges as, say, our states out west. So a lot of us, we do have some areas, for example, that have problems with source water quantity and drought, but we don't have certainly the issues that Western states would have. So the needs are different. And then, of course, the state primacy agencies and what they're doing and what they need, our services may differ a little bit. But by and large, I think we all do a lot of the same things. So I asked each of our states to provide a list of things they would like to highlight just as examples, but certainly the list of services they provide is quite a bit longer than these. So in Michigan, for example, they do a number of rate studies a year. They do a lot of environmental assessment reports, particularly for USDA funding. GIS mapping is something that started there a couple of years ago, and our GIS team has mapped several systems in Michigan now. Certainly a lot of board training and starting to do some condition assessment of distribution systems. Next slide. In Indiana, recently they've been involved in teaching M36 water loss audit classes to certify water audit validators. And of course, they also help many communities with asset management, and they do a lot of training. And they just, on a day-to-day basis, provide comprehensive on-site technical assistance. Next slide. In West Virginia, they help a lot of communities with those compliance issues, operational issues. They work a lot with operators and systems to help them address sanitary survey deficiencies, leak detection, cross-connection surveys. They do quite a bit of operator training, troubleshooting and optimization of the treatment facilities. And they also help a number of communities with consumer confidence reports each year. Kentucky, they've done quite a bit in the area of cross-connection control and training and outreach for the public. They also have a pretty robust GIS program. They've helped many systems now with mapping and developing applications for their distribution system maintenance records. Next slide. And in Illinois, this is where we have concentrated a lot of our efforts in shared services facilitation, regional collaboration training, and then of course the staff there do a lot of project development and grant writing, water audits, and rate studies. Next slide. Wisconsin, we do work with tribes up in Wisconsin, and so we have we have an operator there who provides technical assistance to the tribes. We do a lot of work with systems on certainly funding administration, fiscal training, water audits. We also do tailgate trainings there for distribution systems where we're bringing out maybe a valve exerciser on the back of a truck or another piece of equipment and doing a small training on site for the system operators and operational staff. Next slide. And then of course we come to Ohio. And all of these examples I've mentioned, these are just on the drinking water side. Of course, we have a number of services that we provide to communities on the wastewater side, and often those folks in the communities we work in, they are doing both. They're small enough where they're wearing both hats. So in Ohio, and this is what I was going to talk about next, we have been able to grow a very large technical assistance program, and we've done this by taking those federal funding sources, building that program and leveraging state and local funds so that we have a lot more staff and we're able to provide a lot of services and reach a lot of communities. Next slide. So last year, and I mentioned earlier in my presentation, we helped about 700, it was actually closer to 750 communities last year across the region. And out of those, 317 were in Ohio. And then for many of those communities, we worked on more than one project and or we provided more than one service. So in some of these communities, we may have a couple of projects enrolled under our programs. So we're really able to reach a lot of communities in our state by having those resources to have the staff here. Next slide. How do we build that program? So certainly taking our federal funding sources, and I included ARC, the Appalachian Regional Commission, in there because we have gotten quite a bit of funding through them to help develop our GIS services. And then this is really important. We receive money from the Ohio Division of Drinking and Groundwaters through the set-aside funding that they get, and also through the Ohio Water Development Authority. Those two programs together fund about half of our services. So they're a really important funding source, and they've enabled us to go out there and reach so many more communities than we really could have by solely relying on our federal funding sources. And then in addition to that, over the years, we've developed a fee-for-service program, or we will, in some cases, ask for local matches on different types of services through some of our programs. That has enabled us, again, to expand the program, reach more communities, and also for some types of services, it gives the community a little bit of skin in the game, and I think that helps. they may take the services, I don't want to say a little more seriously, but you know, I think, for example, with rate studies, which is one that we, in Ohio at least, will often charge as a fee for service. That service is very reasonably priced as compared to what they would pay other firms. I mean, again, we don't have a stake in the outcome of that, so we're going to give them an honest opinion. And I think that they are more willing to take the recommendations that we make at the end. And we've found that anecdotally that is often the case, that they are taking and passing rate legislation following our recommendations. So we've really been able to build this comprehensive technical assistance program with what Bud Mason, who's our regional coordinator, he would call stackable services. This all ties together. We have our GIS services, our technical and operations expertise, and our project development, funding, and financial management expertise. And this is how we've been able to build a really amazing program in Ohio. Next slide. So of course, we figure out funding strategies and we coordinate multiple funders to help our communities get their projects funded. And in Ohio, we have a lot of funding sources, a lot of agencies that get involved in funding and the decision making as far as who is going to get funded. And we work with all of them. And I think that's really one of our strengths. We know these programs. We know, you know, this is our job to know these programs, and we know how to work across them. And in many of our projects for our communities, we have multiple funders involved. We work with primarily low and moderate income communities, and we try to get certainly as many grant dollars as we can in the projects. Oftentimes, especially if it's a larger project, we may have at a minimum 3, sometimes 5, even 6 funders involved in a project. So we're involved in trying to coordinate all of them, make sure folks are staying on schedule, meeting their milestones to try and bring it all together. Next slide. And just in Ohio, over the last 18 months, we've leveraged over $100 million in grants and low interest loans. And you know, this is really where the using those set aside funds, we help communities access those SRF dollars. And again, it's not just accessing those, but also then bringing in CDBG and other funding sources to make the project affordable for these small communities. Next slide. The past couple of years too, we've established a condition assessment team, and this is pretty exciting for us. We were able to get some funding through the Ohio Water Development Authority to purchase equipment, both on the drinking water and wastewater side. I'm highlighting what we do on the drinking water side, but we have a valve exerciser, we have pressure testing, line locating, meter testing equipment. Recently, we got a drone to help with water tower quick inspections. So we've started to go out and use this. We use it oftentimes in our training events, and then just to go out, our operators will take this equipment out to help communities if they need troubleshooting or they just need training on how to use it. So that's been a real boost for our program to be able to access this equipment. Next slide. We do a lot of training in Ohio. And I think last year we had close to 60 training events. A lot of this is funded through Ohio EPA for us. So we do a range of board training on many topics related to project development, sustainable management, financial management, asset management, rate setting. And then we also certainly have technical training geared more toward the operators. So for example, manganese compliance classes were very popular this year, valve exercising classes. Recently we rolled out a new class on how to write SOPs. So we reach certainly well over 1,000, well over 1,000 people each year through these training events. And we also have a number of webinars each year and some self-paced online training classes, which we will be developing more of those in the future. Next slide. One of the things that we started in Ohio and we've taken it to some of our other states are what we call our field days. And these are really fun events. We get outside, people come and we have different tracks. And this is really a hands-on training event where we're showing people best management practices for using equipment and maintaining their distribution system. We'll have a couple of vendors come in to help with that. But these are really great days of training, and we'll have 2 more of those coming up this year in our state. Next slide. I want to highlight our GIS team. So we started a GIS team back in 2010, and it's slowly grown over the years. We have a GIS cooperative that is serving certainly over 50 communities now, and we've mapped well over 130 communities at this point, with inventorying, mapping, and rolling out custom web and mobile applications. And we are an Esri shop. We have professional GIS staff on board who are doing this work, and it's really been great for our program to have this capability because it all feeds into the other type of work we're doing with asset management and operator training. Next slide. So just highlighting some of the training that the GIS team does. Next slide. And showing, I just want to point this out as an example, an application we've set up for communities to enter their service line material information. So particularly for communities that need to inventory their service lines and identify their lead service lines, this is an app that they can use to record that information. Next slide. We do a lot of asset management plans. In Ohio, this became mandatory for all of our public water systems about 2 years ago. And we were really leading this effort well before that for several years. So we do a number of these, and we do a lot of training in this area to help communities develop their asset management plans. Next slide. And just a screenshot from one of those to help communities with their predictive maintenance escrows, figuring that out. Next slide. And the last thing I'd like to point out, as a nonprofit and as technical assistance providers, we have that agility to respond to things. So if there's an urgent need, our staff are ready to gear up and get in there and help. So just this past month, when we realized that this pandemic was going to have a pretty big impact on our systems, we got to work right away on putting together a pandemic toolkit and also putting together a couple of webinars focused on the small systems. Some of the other industry groups certainly have done some webinars recently, but we wanted to tailor this one to our smaller communities. And if you're interested, on our website, glrcap.org, you can check out the pandemic toolkit that we put together, and we're continuing to add links and other items as we find them that especially are going to help our smaller systems. Next slide. Okay, and so when you bring it all together, we have a great program, very comprehensive, in trying to help our small and rural communities.